Well, so let's transition into, the expenses that families incur. Like a lot of people are like, oh, it's just the cremation. Well, they may not even understand what that cost is, but you have experience. Like there's a laundry list of expenses that somebody's having to pay for when a loved one passes away. And you'd sent me some numbers the other day, kind of going through like the national averages on that. Like, what are some of those expenses that families have?
So the National Funeral Directors Association, which is kind of the longest standing national representation of funeral professionals, and quite honestly internationally as well, we get together regionally all the time in one big gathering like this year in Nashville. And I would say 5 years, they put out a cost study or the GPL, which is short for General Price List. Every funeral home in the U.S., if they're a licensed funeral establishment and operating in accordance with the FTC, should have what's called a general price list, which includes all of the charges in the funeral home, or most of them, accompanied by cost of caskets on what we call the outer burial container list, or vaults, right, that are used for burial of a casket or of an urn. So just some like basic averages for you to kind of think on. The average funeral, both cremation and burial combined, coast to coast, what does that cost combined on just pure averages? We're looking right around in 2019, $7,700, $7,700.
So that's assuming 50% of people are being cremated, 50% approximately are having a traditional being buried.
Correct. So if we break that down even to further subcategories, the average burial contract with a funeral home, now mind you, these are just funeral expenses, funeral home services, and merchandise. There are three parts to a funeral home contract. We have the professional services, things like funeral director services of funeral director and staff, embalming, taking the person into our care 24/7, the use of facilities, so services, right? Then we have merchandise, caskets, vaults, urns, urn vaults, memorial packages. And then there's this often forgot this what we call cash advances or accommodation sections, which are outside charges of the funeral home, but often get lumped in. So the figures I'll give you of an average burial do not include that third section, which can add up quickly, as I'll point out. So for an average burial, we're looking at in 2019, $9,135. If you take the laws of average of inflation and add 2%, 2.5% over the last 3-4 years, probably going to look somewhere in the next 5 years closer to $10,000, right? For a cremation, which includes a visiting with the body present, followed by a service, followed then by cremation, most people will often ask sometimes now about a rental casket, which is used, I would say, over and over again to a certain degree, but
just for the viewing.
Correct. And then the portion of the casket, the interior, is then removed with that individual and cremated. The shell of the casket is reused. So if you use that type of casket, they're averaging coast to coast around $6,150, right? What you're probably seeing most difference there is the cost of the burial vault, where that needs to be added on to the burial side of things. So that's what costs the increase on the funeral home side there. So those are, you're talking average of 7,700, you're talking average of 9,100, even if we're rounding up over the next, 5 years for the next study, let's say it's closer to
$11,000. Yeah.
Right. And $6,100, 6,200 now, probably closer to 7, right? When we do this next study. I often say to people, would you plan for that type of purchase in normal life? Do you plan for a $10,000 purchase? Well, yeah, of course. You plan for a $7,700 purchase? Well, absolutely. Yeah. So it's no different, right? And guess what? This is a guarantee, right? 100% club. Like I said before, taxes and death. I realize it's not exciting, but when people see those numbers, sometimes that's where I can talk till I'm red in the face about the emotional benefits, the legal benefits that come along with planning and understanding who will really legally be in charge. And then lastly, which I'm not sure if that's really the order of importance we should be in. Maybe we should talk about the financial piece first, but I am a heart guy, so I tend to think that most people will see the value even by just having choices made. And then again, this financial piece just makes more sense. But that financial piece of having a plan is where you go from a good plan to a great plan, which is a good
Right.
book too, by the way, Good to Great. But that is really where they all come together. We all plan for these types of purchases that are in the thousands. We need to take this head on. And we haven't even talked about that third section yet, what we call the cash advance items, right?
Right.
So if there's
What
a
does that
burial,
look like?
sure. So like death certificates are often lumped in to the cost of the service. Not the case. Those are always outside cost. Each county, each state, each city, depends on where you are, have different types of charges for their death certificates. It just depends. Flowers, musicians, honorariums for the officiant, right? I've seen honorariums go in the thousands for the priest that has served their family for years. And they're okay doing it. And I am too. It's what mom wanted, is to give a donation to father. Totally cool, but it's $1,000.
Right.
We plan for $1,000 purchases, unless you're on Amazon or going to Costco. But we got things like, maybe it's special hairdresser, the big one, grave opening and closing. If the grave isn't purchased around here, the Metro Detroit area, the most reputable cemeteries, you get a country cemetery that might charge $500 for a grave. The cemeteries in the city are charging $2,500 for a grave, per grave. So you got $5,000. If dad dies suddenly, mom's going to the cemetery, hastily picking out a final resting place. And she's probably buying 2 graves, because one for herself and her now deceased husband. So now you're at $5,000 at the cemetery. Opening and closing for those now are $1,500 a piece. So you're $8,000 at the cemetery. And we haven't even talked about the headstone, Phil, right? Which can range from, cemetery requirements requiring a flat cemetery marker, which tend to be the most affordable, but maybe it's bronze what the cemetery requires. So maybe that's a, $2,500 to $3,000 bronze plaque required by the cemetery. So now we're at another $10,000.
Right.
And maybe that monument, mom wanted a jet black with a polished top and the scene of the farm in the back, which everybody can agree upon, and they love that idea. But that jet black upright monument is another $7,500. And again, it might be a 12 by 12 black flat gray marker that is simple as that, but that's still $995 to have placed. And that's still a purchase that we should probably talk about.
Right. Well, and then you got families now live all over the country. Rarely does everybody live in the same town anymore. People forget that the executor of the estate is legally, with major repercussions if they mess up, required to settle the estate. That can take months or longer, and they're not compensated for that unless it's actually written out in the plan. Travel expenses and all these things. Like I had
Luncheon
this
too,
conversation,
right? Luncheon, the after the service, those can be, I've seen those be more expensive than the funeral.
We might do open bar.
Right.
It sounds like we're planning a wedding as opposed to a funeral almost, but it really is like as expensive as doing a wedding. It's a lot of the same things.
And we're doing it in 3 days.
Right.
So removing this piece is just critical. It's a piece that has not been talked about enough on our professional level. And I'll even own some of that as a funeral professional. And this is where I've dedicated the last 7 years of telling people, after listening, trying to communicate how important this is. Because back to the point, they have the funds, they've planned for retirement. They've had the opportunity to be in a good spot financially. And this part is just avoided. But I'm on this mission, you're on this mission to communicate that these funds need to be available. Not like should they be, they need to be.
Because a lot of times, John, we'll have people say, well, Phil, I'm worth $5 million.
Mm-hmm.
I got so much money. They don't say it like that. They're like, I have plenty of money. And they're like, if it's 25, 30 grand and I want that headstone, whatever, that's fine. but they don't realize that $5 million is not available for the family.
Right.
Or they'll say, well, Phil, my son's an attorney. My daughter's a doctor. They both have plenty of money. They can figure it out.
Right.
And I'm like, do you really want your kids in the funeral home? Maybe they can't afford it, but maybe they're arguing over who's going to get the miles on their Amex Platinum.
Mm-hmm.
You're leaving them money. Why wouldn't you show them that you had enough forethought to set it aside so they didn't have to think about it? They could focus on that life. And so whether somebody's got a little bit of money or a lot of money, I've found that sometimes people that have a lot of money need it even more.
I agree.
Because that money is going to be tied up for longer
Mm-hmm.
before the family actually gets access to it.
Yes. So we'll just keep down that path that, there is a vacuum period, whether you have a little money or a lot of money. As a child, I'm a funeral director, a dad, a son, all these things, right? And I've experienced both planning for thousands of people face to face, eyeball to eyeball, and I've experienced the death, planning for a death. And my dad and we were a perfect example. They're spread, all the kids are spread across the country. I'm the funeral director in the family. When my dad died last March, guess who got tapped to plan this, which, oh, by the way, was already planned and paid for. And the idea and I saw that work, and I saw how even somebody that understands the business, and through a plan like this, we were able to execute quickly on signatures versus conversation.
Right.
I had the conversation with my dad about what type of service he wanted and what we would need as a family, right? Because he was even that guy that said, well, just cremate me. And I'm like, we can't do that. You have 4 kids, you have 7 brothers and sisters. We're not just going to cremate you. You're too important to us.
Right.
Would you be open to us having a gathering period to honor you? And when we talked about that and what that would look like, he was all about it. And I said, well, that's great, but now how are we going to pay for it? So,
right.
Because
you would have gotten stuck paying for it more
100%.
than likely.
And I always tell people, look, just because I'm a funeral director doesn't mean I get funerals for free. It's not like a flight attendant program here. In a companion, you get X amount of flights for free a year. It's not like that. And I'm expected to pay on time. So the fact that I was able to have a plan like this and sign off, my brothers and sisters were able to sign off, and that funeral home that cared for my family and my dad during our time of loss was paid within not 48, but 24 hours. They were expediting that for us. It took the weight off my shoulders of somebody that was going through it, even as a professional. So I can speak to it personally, that I've experienced how with 4 siblings that most of us all of us get along on an average day, but there are things that we can't agree on, like pizza toppings. So when my dad's dead, that would probably be the time where we couldn't agree. And It had already started. But guess what? We had the paper that said, this is what Dad wanted. If there's any huge objections to this, let's talk about it. But it made it pretty clear. And again, the financial piece was there with it.
Right.
So packaged
because that
nicely.
tends to be the trigger for a lot of people is money. Let's face it, that's what most marriages fight over.
Mm-hmm.
Families, business partners, siblings, like money is a main component to a lot of arguments and disagreements.
It's true. And funeral homes need to be paid. They should be paid for their services, especially the ones that are every day making a difference, that are in a difference in care and not showing up just to show up and uninterested. The ones that are really doing their job well, I always say, should be paid on time. Because they performed what they said they would at the highest level and exceeded your expectations. And this allows them to be paid, and the family can say, fantastic.
Yeah.
We're not reaching into our wallet. Mom made this decision to move from, like you say, from one pocket to the other, as opposed to, buying something else.
Right.